Welcome to the Future of Education. Excited to be with Tom Dawson, who's the now interim CEO at Strada Education Network. We're going to get into what Strada does. They're a fascinating new philanthropy, I would say, that is really on the cutting edge of of how to think about the intersection of education and the workforce in truly novel ways. But first, Tom, welcome. It's good to see you.
Nice to see you as well, Michael. It's good to be back in touch.
Yeah, likewise. And for those that don't know, Tom and I grew up in the same neck of the woods, so we've had some knowledge of each other for a little while. But you've obviously had quite a career, ranging from senior roles at the Gates Foundation and the U.S. Department of Education, where you've gotten to craft policies in the wake of the .com economic collapse, and now you have this opportunity, right, with an incredible portfolio of giving activities, an incredible portfolio of organizations that you all directly own and support. I'd love you, though, first to sort of reflect across, right, the wave of your work about, some of the big shifts that you've seen in education philanthropy over the last couple of decades, just to give us that bird's eye view that I think you're one of a handful of people to uniquely have.
Sure. So I would say two things, and I think back to like 10 years ago, say, when I was at the Gates Foundation, and I would point out what's changed from when I was at Gates to now that I'm at Strada. And I'd point out two things. The first is when I was first at Gates, the notion of college completion was really a new idea. And most philanthropy, most activities in higher education, a lot of the thought leadership that was being generated was really still around college access and affordability, which are important issues. But when I was at Gates, were just introducing and spending a lot of money and providing a lot of grants in the areas of college completion. And I remember at the time thinking that how long would this take to become more visible and more kind of in the lexicon, if you will. And now fast forward 10 years, and a lot of the organizations that we stood up are now known organizations nationally. Complete College America, for one, I think of, and then I also just think about how states and policymakers and even players in the private sector are now increasingly focused on helping colleges improve completion rates, and that's a noticeable difference over a short period of time. The other thing I would mention, and this is more akin to Strada, is when I was at Gates, it was still, when you think about big philanthropies and how they participated in terms of their grant making and their charitable activities, it was really focused on providing grants. And some novel and creative foundations would do program-related investments, but even that was new, and a lot of foundations felt kind of skittish about that and squeamish about it. Now, fast forward 10 years, and everybody's doing program-related investments if you're a foundation. And moreover, you have this new breed of organization akin to what Strada is, but other players like Chan Zuckerberg and Emerson, where they're focused on pulling multiple levers. Many of them aren't even nonprofit, but to advance a social mission. So that's also relatively, a lot's changed in 10 years. So.
Yeah, look, I think both of those are significant, right? To your point, the shift from college access to college success has been a tidal wave of change in higher education, but also philanthropy. And then on the second, with what you all have frankly led in many ways at Strada, not just making grants, as you said, but actually making investments and owning even for-profits outright. I'd love you to dig in deeper about the why behind that strategy and why you think in general, the sector has become more comfortable with investments in any type of organization, but specifically, obviously, at Strada, you all having a portfolio of organizations that you own and operate, I think would be super illuminating.
Sure. So I would say that Strada, like a lot of organizations, like the kinds I mentioned that have moved into the space, say, over the course of the last 10 years that are not foundations, they're really interested in pulling multiple levers, not just grants. They're largely sector agnostic, whether it's working with for-profit players or governments or nonprofit entities. If you're in a field like education that's so heavily involved with and funded by the government, it's impossible to take a sort of siloed approach. You have to you have to have a multi-sector approach. And we think that being the type of organization we are, with the levers that we pull, is a much greater way of ultimately having impact and bringing to scale some of the effective interventions for the target populations that we seek to serve. If we're really interested in doing that, you have to have a sector agnostic, multiple sector, multiple lever type of approach. So.
It makes sense. Let's double click on that a little bit. So talk about, you all call yourself Strada Education Network. It's not just a Strada Education Philanthropies or Foundation or something like that. So talk a little bit more about that notion of network and why that's such an important concept, because you alluded to it there, but I'd love to dig in a little bit more deeply.
Sure. So network was very intentional. Both our name Strada, which in Italian means winding path, which is supposed to connote, unfortunately, the winding path that a lot of learners are on transitioning between education and employment. But the network part's really important because there's both an internal network. So that's the grants we make. That's the investments that we make in outside parties. That's the affiliates that we operate, both nonprofit and for-profit. But then there's also the external view of being a network, which is that you're working with parties that you may not directly influence. So I think of state governments, policymakers, but you need to have both an internal network approach and an external network approach, again, to have that kind of scale that we're driving toward. So that's the word network was both Strada and network are really the most important two words in the three-word Strada Education Network title. So
it's interesting though, right? Because I think most people would say, "Oh, education must be," but you're purposely expanding beyond just education, recognizing that if you view education as a siloed problem, in effect, you're sort of going to miss the big reason why people enroll, the reason why it's so important in people's lives. And so that connection, sure, the meandering, but I think actually what I like about it is, as opposed to a lot of efforts in education around, everyone should be on a guided pathway, or everyone should have an IT or business certificate, which is super short-term focused. Mm-hmm. It acknowledges that people, do take pathways through life, and they're going to be different from each other and more different than they ever were in the past, where perhaps you'd stay at one company for most of your career. That really is not what most people are going to experience as they get out there. So I think it makes a heck of a lot of sense there. But I guess what the shift from my perspective then is, you're focused very intentionally on measuring that social impact and thinking about that scale toward good, not just scale for its own sake, but toward an outcome. How do you all dig into the measurement around that? Because the more you're entangled, if you will, across the ecosystem, it seems harder to wrap your hands around that measurement.
Yeah. So we, I would say two things. The first is that it's a long path on measurement. We started intentionally measuring the impact of our nonprofit affiliates about 3 or 4 years ago. And we're just this year, frankly, getting the kind of volume of research and data back to actually show what their impact is. And it's not like we're running random control trial studies or, necessarily activities or approaches that are tremendously sophisticated always. It takes a long time to have a sufficient volume of students, to have the commitment from the various parties. If you're working with a university, they have to be open to you, researching the effectiveness on their students. And so as a result, I think when you look at other players in the sector, in the education and training space, when people say impact and you actually look at their impact reports, you see a lot of data on reach, and you see a lot of data on students served, for example. Those are all important things, but because for a variety of reasons, like the one I just mentioned, it's hard to get at impact. We really think there's an opportunity to be kind of a field sort of maker, if you will, around getting organizations like ours, sort of that external network I described before, to focus on common measures of impact. But before we can do that, we have to begin to discover and begin to generate results on the data, for example, that our affiliates are, our nonprofit affiliates that we own and operate are having. So we've started there. And then our plan is to extend that to our investments. Those are the non-controlling investments that we don't own outright. and then also to include our grants as well. So we've started with that which we control the most, which are our affiliates, and we can we can work more closely with them to develop those kinds of impact measures. And then we intend to expand that across the variety of different activities that we're involved with. So
how much can you have measures that are in common? I mean, you all support a diversity of organizations that have very different missions in many cases, that operate in many different spheres. How much can you have metrics that are in common that bring these things together and unify, or how much do you really just need to have a wide net, if you will, that's more disparate?
Yeah, I think we're starting with a wide net. So unlike some, because I have a couple of scars on me for with respect to trying to generate compelled or sector-wide types of metrics where it's just too early to do that. The ambition is the right ambition, but it's just oftentimes the enthusiasm for developing those common metrics exceed the ability or the maturation of the field to do it. So what we're focused on initially out of the gate, Michael, is more how can we measure with our affiliates a common range of data and metrics around our learners completing their degrees and certificates that they start. Once they complete, are they, we talk about completion, value, and purpose. So I just described completion. It's pretty obvious. Value is around, do those learners, after they graduate, after they complete either their degree or certificate, whether it's in a formal degree granting institution or not, do they receive value from the program that they exited from? So, and by that, do they receive a pay increase? Do they move up, in terms of the job that they want? And more quantitative measures. And then around purpose, we're focused on some of the softer measures. So, for example, if you're a low-income learner, were you able, as part of your educational pathway, were you able to develop social capital, for example? Things that are a little softer, but still important to measure. And in our view, you really have to measure all three and treat it as the kind of three legs of the same stool. And what we're focused on in particular is identifying effective interventions around completion, value, and purpose, and saying that the way, whether it's activity that Road Trip Nation is involved with respect to trying to develop social capital with low-income opportunity youth who go out on road trips, or college completion with the work that Insight Track does, is showing that our performance with a particular intervention exceeds the performance of a relevant standard in the field. So in the case of Insight Track, what's the graduation rate at that particular institution, or what's the graduation rate writ large for community colleges or for four-year institutions? So it's about effective interventions, compared to a relevant standard or benchmark. So
yeah, that's helpful. I mean,
and then scaling what we learn.
Gotcha. Just an aside, actually, because I hadn't thought about it before, but, social capital is obviously becoming a much more important area of investment right now in the field. I think people are waking up to the fact that knowledge and skills are important, but beyond a baseline, it's who you know, not what you know, and the importance of having mentors and relationships and things that unlock opportunity. You all were actually quite ahead of that trend. I would argue at Strata, investing in that many years ago. The acquisition of Road Trip Nation, I think, was, you correct me if I'm wrong, but like maybe 5-6 years ago at this point.
Yep.
Yeah. So
2016. So yeah, 5 years ago. Time flies.
So deeply ahead of that. Yeah, right. It turns around quick. But the reason I guess I mention it is because you're always peering around corners. You're thinking about what's to come. The recession, obviously, and the pandemic have resulted in a series of changes. There's a lot of speculation. Things will never go back to normal on the one hand. To the moment we have herd immunity, people are going to slip back into their old familiar routines as quickly as possible. I'm sort of curious how you see this playing out in the sectors that you're watching and investing in, and if it's going to shift your investment strategy or your focus at all.
Well, the first thing I would say is we don't fully know, obviously, and so I would be remiss if I said that we've made any decisions about how the effects of the pandemic and the recession will affect our activities. Having said that, we are learning sort of initial things about how the pandemic has affected learners. So as you may know, I'm sure you know, Michael, but folks who are joining may know, we do a lot of work around assessing consumer insights. We had a relationship with Gallup. Throughout the course of the pandemic, we were releasing on a regular basis a variety of different kind of short burst evaluations and studies of what consumer feedback was on how the pandemic was affecting decision making. And one of the things we found was that, especially with adults, is that they are increasingly there was some truth to this prior to the pandemic, but based on the feedback that we saw as a result of the work that we did during the pandemic, they are looking for, adult learners in particular, are looking for opportunities to improve their skill acquisition. And I would really focus on that word skill acquisition, because they aren't necessarily looking for a degree or a credential in a certain area from a certain institution. They're looking about how to improve the skills that they possess to make them more relevant. And so as a result, they'll go to a variety of different providers, whether it's or they are open to going, I should say, to a variety of different providers, whether it's traditional institutions, whether it's competency-based institutions like WGU or other providers, whether it's on-the-job learning. They are hungry and open to a variety of different pathways with respect to where they learn and where they improve their skills. And it doesn't have to take place necessarily in a traditional institution. Most learners still go to a traditional institution, but there is increasing openness to going outside of that. So
I mean, that part is actually fascinating, right? And your survey was the first place, I think, that picked up this set of indicators, which was in past recessions, students flock back to higher ed, and the prevailing wisdom is, higher ed is counter-cyclical. Community colleges that, depending on the data set you look at, have been losing a lot of students over the last 10 years. They're all going to come back and so forth. And that's not what we've seen, both in your early insights predicting this, but then it's materialized, right? We haven't seen students rushing back to degree programs, but they are going to short-term programs that are super focused on skill acquisition, as you said. Early predictions, I guess, from you, because we don't know for sure, but since you're able to see the pulse of this going ahead, do you see that continuing to increase, people's awareness of these new programs increasing and looking for new options? Or do you think that maybe there'll be some retrenchment to more historical behavior?
I think the trend is here to stay. Does the rate of increase continue on the path that it's on? That's uncertain. No, but I think the openness and the willingness to experiment with new types of programs that are really focused on skill acquisition, that precedes the recession and precedes the pandemic. I just think the pandemic accelerated it. And I think that's for a whole host of reasons. All the news and all of the, frankly, experience that a lot of learners have with excessive amounts of student debt, or not having the time necessarily to go back for a full degree. Most students now are adult learners, and they have families, they have jobs, and the traditional way of going to education that I went to school and you went to school is not relevant for an increasing and growing share of learners. So no, I think it's here to stay. I think the part that will be really interesting, and the part that we're seeing evidence of, particularly with some of our investments and some of the work with our affiliates, is that traditional institutions, I would caution about viewing them, skill acquisition and traditional institutions, as being mutually exclusive. I think we're seeing a lot of evidence that the more entrepreneurial and thoughtful traditional institutions are moving increasingly into the skill acquisition space. So whether it's acquisition of boot camps, or whether it's just a variety of different approaches that creative entrepreneurial institutions are moving into. And so I think you'll see increasingly a lot of those institutions becoming responsive, not all of them, but the creative ones, the ones that will ultimately win the day, are the ones I think that will be open and be flexible and increasingly adopt some of these practices that adult learners show they're interested in around skill acquisition. So
Yeah, and obviously Southern New Hampshire University
Sure.
acquiring Kenzie recently is a textbook example of
Yep.
that. And this is a topic I'm super interested in, obviously from my book Choosing College. I guess it's on the other shoulder, but in terms of why do students take these actions, but you also have invested a lot in research and understanding, if you will, the demand part of the economy in terms of the skills that are actually desired. MZ is an investment you all have in your portfolio. Can you talk a little bit about what you're starting to see in the data itself around what the labor market is valuing and how these short-term programs do or don't contribute toward that? I think in particular, and we'll start to shift to the Washington, D.C. lens and a little bit of some of the policies and so forth. But, there's a lot of people that want more support for short-term programs. At the same time, I had two secretaries of education on my podcast just a few weeks ago, and they were both skeptical about extending to shorter than 15-week programs because the data historically hasn't been that good. But data lags by definition, right? So what are you all learning from that resource of MC and any other feelers you have out in the marketplace around what's being asked by employers and sort of outcomes from these different types of skill-based programs?
Yeah, I think employers. So two things. Your point about how data lags. Well, sometimes employers lag too. And being an employer, I can say that we sometimes lag as well. And so sometimes there's still a mindset among a lot of employers that the degree programs connote a certain set of skills that someone who possesses a degree versus someone who doesn't is more likely to have. And so that's it's not like that has been revolutionized overnight. That still tends to be the trend, but it is changing. And I think a lot of employers are growing frustrated. Are growing frustrated with sort of the glacial pace of change in a lot of traditional higher education. So I would say that based on what we see, most employers still have that preference for the degree. The data bears that out over time. But I think because data does lag, to your point, and employers sometimes lag too in their hiring practices, it is changing, and it's changing more quickly than it has in the past. With respect to your question around policy, Strada doesn't have a defined policy agenda on that question you posed. But I would just say from where I sit, we talk about being learner focused, and at Strada in terms of our investments and our grant making. And if you're going to be learner focused, we should be open to different types of programs and allowing dollars to follow students to those different programs, provided that the results are satisfactory and adequate. A lot of that lagging data, comes from a lot of the newer entrants into the market aren't reflected in that lagging data. So I don't put a lot of stock oftentimes in that lagging data. So I think it'll be really interesting to see what it looks like 5 years from now when we look at that data, right now, 2 years from now, 3 years from now, 5 years from now. So.
Yeah, no, that's it makes a ton of sense. I mean, as my mentor Clay Christensen always said, the really unfortunate thing about data is it's only backward looking, and by definition, and it's only convincingly so in the way distant past, right? So you actually need theory and observation to project forward, because the future isn't always like the past. So and hopefully, fortunately, in some dimensions here.
Yeah.
I guess as we sort of wrap up this conversation together. I'm curious, as you're looking at the Biden administration, speaking about policy, new folks in town, but many of them familiar faces. Several of them, obviously. What's one policy initiative that they're looking at that you're watching quite closely right now and monitoring?
So I think the pending legislation that I just got an email this morning about. A version of some of the pending legislation about making resources more readily available in workforce training and primarily in that workforce training realm, whether it's the WIOA Act or some of the programs that have a workforce orientation out of either the Labor Department or the Education Department. Those the desire of the Biden administration to fund those programs at significantly higher levels are interesting, and I think the challenge will be, while historically many of those programs, admittedly have been underfunded. I think the challenge will be that from what we see, most learners, when it comes to career navigation and the transition between education and employment, they suffer from what we call a first mile problem, which is they don't know where to go to get the information that they need to make relevant career decisions. So that's why we invest in things like Road Trip Nation, which is all about solving that first mile problem, which is I have an interest in a particular field, or I'm vocationally inclined to be an engineer or an artist, or what's a career path that will allow me to have a livable wage and provide for my family, but still be true to what I'm interested in, and what's the educational path I need to be on to do that. The challenge with the significant increase in resources is it will provide a lot more money, but it doesn't really get at that first issue, which is there's still really siloed activity between education and employment. Despite all of the improvements that we've made, there's still that siloed approach to education and workforce development, and simply pouring more money into one or more of them will not address the first mile problem. And I think there are limits to what government alone can do on that. It's not really their fault, but that's why you need to have this multi-dimensional approach with foundations, with organizations like ours, with for-profit players, and with government. So,
gotcha. Are you hoping that there will be movement, perhaps not from the administration-led, but from Congress, to connect some of those databases between Department of Labor and Department of Education, so at least there's better information out
Absolutely.
there? How important is that?
No, I think it is important. Kind of more controversially, I think back to all of the discussion, probably 8-10 years ago now, around gainful employment, and gosh, it might even be longer than that. I'm starting to date myself, but and that would require connectivity between Social Security data and Education Department data. That's important. That's important, but it is insufficient. That first mile problem, which is a much trickier problem to address, is until we solve that, you can pour in billions of dollars, and I think you might get some incremental improvements, but you won't get the kind of holistic improvements that I'm excited by. A lot of these new entrants that we help to support and help to fund, I think they more immediately address those issues, and so hopefully they can attract some of this support, some of this funding, and hopefully that there'll be greater collaboration between the various players in the space. So.
Good stuff, Tom. No, I appreciate it. And there's a lot of talk about the last mile problem, but I think you're absolutely right. That first mile problem is significant. It's a huge barrier, not one that we talk nearly enough about. So appreciate you raising that to the forum, along with all the giving and research that you all do. So thanks for joining us.
Great. Thanks very much.
Yep. Everyone be well. And thanks so much for tuning in.